The fall of the Berlin Wall on November 9, 1989 stands as one of the most iconic moments of the 20th century, symbolizing the end of the Cold War and the reunification of a divided Germany. For nearly 3 decades, the Berlin Wall had been a stark and oppressive physical reminder of the ideological divide between the communist East and the capitalist West. Its construction in 1961 severed families, friends, and communities, creating an enduring image of division and the broader struggle between two opposing world orders. The Cold War, which emerged in the aftermath of World War II, was defined by the rivalry between the United States and the Soviet Union. This global contest for dominance was fought not on battlefields but through proxy wars, political maneuvering, and economic competition. Berlin, the once united capital of Germany, became the epicenter of this confrontation. Situated in the heart of East Germany but divided into 4 Allied-occupied zones after World War II, the city came to symbolize the stark contrast between the two ideologies. By the 1950s, these differences became increasingly visible. West Berlin, supported by Western powers, flourished as a beacon of freedom and economic prosperity. In stark contrast, East Berlin, under Soviet control, struggled under a rigid communist system. The disparity between the two sides led to a mass exodus of East Germans seeking better opportunities in the West. By 1961, an estimated 3.5 million people had fled the German Democratic Republic (GDR), often using Berlin as their escape route. This brain drain threatened the stability of the East German regime, prompting drastic measures. The construction of the Berlin Wall was the Soviet bloc's response to this growing crisis. On August 13, 1961, East German authorities with Soviet backing began erecting the wall almost overnight. Initially made of barbed wire and makeshift barriers, it was soon fortified with concrete and armed guard towers. The wall stretched over 155 kilometers, 96 miles, encircling West Berlin and effectively turning it into an isolated enclave. For East Germans, the wall was a brutal reality, cutting off access to freedom, opportunity, and even loved ones on the other side. The wall was more than just a physical barrier, it represented the broader division of Europe into Eastern and Western blocs. It became the defining symbol of the Iron Curtain, a term Winston Churchill famously used to describe the geopolitical boundary between the free world and the Soviet-dominated East. The construction of the Berlin Wall marked a significant escalation in the Cold War, hardening the divide between the superpowers and deepening the ideological rift. For those living in Berlin, the wall was a constant reminder of the tensions between East and West. Families were torn apart, with loved ones suddenly finding themselves on opposite sides of the barrier. The desperation to escape the oppressive conditions of the East led to daring and often tragic attempts to breach the wall. Some tunneled beneath it, others braved the minefields and guard towers, and many paid the ultimate price. By the time the wall fell, over 100 people had died trying to cross it. Throughout its existence, the Berlin Wall became a site of protest, a canvas for graffiti, and a potent symbol of resistance. It was featured in countless speeches and became a focal point for international attention. U.S. presidents, from John F. Kennedy's famous Ich bin ein Berliner speech in 1963 to Ronald Reagan's challenge to tear down this wall in 1987, used it to highlight the ideological stakes of the Cold War. Yet, for all its symbolism, the wall was also an everyday reality for Berliners, a barrier that shaped their lives in ways large and small. The fall of the Berlin Wall was the culmination of decades of geopolitical, economic, and social pressures. By the late 1980s, cracks were beginning to appear in the communist regimes across Eastern Europe. Economic stagnation, growing dissent, and the reformist policies of Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev created an environment ripe for change. In East Germany, protests demanding freedom and reform gained momentum, culminating in the events of November 1989. When the wall finally came down, it was not just a victory for the people of Berlin, but a transformative moment for the world. The images of Berliners from both sides celebrating together, chipping away at the wall, became a powerful symbol of unity and hope. The event marked the beginning of the end for the Cold War and set the stage for the reunification of Germany, which would be officially completed less than a year later. The Berlin Wall's construction in 1961 was a defining moment in Cold War history, signaling a deepening divide between the Eastern and Western blocs. To understand why it was built, one must examine the geopolitical tensions and social pressures that preceded its erection. By the late 1950s, Berlin had become a flashpoint in the ideological struggle between the United States and the Soviet Union, with the city's unique position as a divided capital intensifying the stakes for both sides. Following World War II, Germany was partitioned into 4 occupation zones controlled by the United States, the Soviet Union, the United Kingdom, and France. Berlin, although located entirely within the Soviet-controlled Eastern Zone, was also divided into 4 sectors. This arrangement created a peculiar situation. West Berlin, composed of the American, British, and French sectors, became an enclave of Western democracy and capitalism within the Soviet-controlled East Germany, officially known as the German Democratic Republic (GDR). The economic and political differences between East and West Berlin quickly became apparent. West Berlin, buoyed by the Marshall Plan and Western economic policies, experienced rapid growth and prosperity. In contrast, East Berlin struggled under Soviet-style central planning, which led to economic stagnation and limited personal freedoms. The disparity created a powerful incentive for East Germans to flee to the West, using Berlin as their escape route. Between 1949 and 1961, approximately 3.5 million East Germans, nearly 20% of the GDR's population, defected to the West, many through Berlin. This mass exodus posed a serious threat to the East German government, both economically and politically. The loss of skilled workers, intellectuals, and young professionals, often referred to as the brain drain, weakened the GDR's economy and undermined the legitimacy of its regime. Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev and East German leader Walter Ulbricht viewed the situation as unsustainable. To stem the flow of refugees, they decided to take drastic measures. On the night of August 12–13, 1961, East German authorities, with support from the Soviet Union, began constructing a physical barrier to isolate West Berlin from the surrounding East German territory. In a matter of hours, barbed wire fencing was erected along the border, cutting off streets, railways, and access points that connected the two sides of the city. Over the following weeks, this temporary barrier was replaced with a more permanent structure, the Berlin Wall. The wall evolved rapidly, becoming an imposing and fortified boundary. By the mid-1960s, it was a concrete barrier stretching over 155 kilometers, 96 miles, complete with guard towers, floodlights, and a wide death strip filled with anti-vehicle trenches, spike strips, and tripwire-triggered automatic guns. This formidable system was designed not just to prevent crossings, but to deter any attempts at defection. The wall bisected the city, severing neighborhoods and families and encircling West Berlin to isolate it from the east entirely. The construction of the Berlin Wall shocked the world. Western powers, including the United States, condemned the move but avoided direct military intervention, fearing it could escalate into a larger conflict. President John F. Kennedy, while publicly denouncing the wall as a shameful symbol of oppression, privately viewed it as a preferable alternative to open conflict with the Soviet Union. For the people of Berlin, however, the wall was a brutal reality that disrupted lives and created a sense of hopelessness for those trapped in the East. The immediate impact of the wall was profound. Families were separated overnight, with no warning or chance to say goodbye. Commuters who had worked in West Berlin but lived in the East were suddenly cut off from their jobs. Many East Berliners found themselves trapped in a system that offered little freedom and few opportunities. The wall became a stark reminder of the ideological divide that defined the Cold War, symbolizing not just the separation of Berlin, but the division of the entire world into Eastern and Western spheres of influence. The Berlin Wall also transformed the city into a focal point of Cold War tensions. Western leaders used it as a symbol of the oppression and failures of communism, while Eastern leaders framed it as a protective measure against Western interference. Propaganda on both sides exploited the wall's existence, amplifying its significance as more than just a physical barrier, it was a psychological one as well. Despite its intent to maintain control, the wall could not fully contain the desire for freedom. Over the years, countless East Germans attempted to escape, risking their lives to cross the heavily guarded boundary. While some succeeded, many others were captured or killed, highlighting the human cost of the division. The Berlin Wall stood as a grim testament to the lengths authoritarian regimes would go to suppress dissent and control their populations. The construction of the Berlin Wall marked a turning point in the Cold War, solidifying Berlin's status as a divided city and a symbol of global tensions. For nearly 3 decades, it stood as a physical and ideological barrier, shaping the lives of millions and reinforcing the reality of the Iron Curtain. As we explore the life behind the wall in the next section, we will delve deeper into the experiences of those who lived in its shadow and the relentless human spirit that sought to overcome its oppression. The construction of the Berlin Wall in 1961 did more than just divide a city, it reshaped the lives of millions on both sides. For the residents of East and West Berlin, the wall was an unrelenting physical and psychological barrier, dictating where they could go, who they could see, and how they lived their daily lives. Its presence became a stark symbol of the Cold War, but for those living in its shadow, it was a constant reminder of the fractured world they inhabited. In East Berlin, life under the German Democratic Republic (GDR) was defined by strict governmental control. The state, under the ruling Socialist Unity Party (SED), enforced a rigid communist ideology. Personal freedoms were severely curtailed and citizens lived under the watchful eye of the Stasi, the East German secret police. The Stasi maintained an extensive network of informants, ensuring that dissent was swiftly identified and suppressed. Fear permeated daily life as people could not fully trust their neighbors, colleagues, or even family members. Economically, East Berlin lagged far behind its Western counterpart. The centralized economy struggled to provide basic goods, leading to chronic shortages of food, clothing, and consumer products. Long queues for essential items were a common sight. In contrast, West Berliners enjoyed a flourishing capitalist system that offered access to luxury goods, modern infrastructure, and higher standards of living. This stark disparity was visible even from the east, as West Berlin's illuminated streets and vibrant city life stood in stark contrast to the more subdued and austere conditions of the east. The wall not only separated two economies but also tore apart families and friendships. Many Berliners had relatives and close friends on the opposite side of the city. Before the wall's construction, East and West Berliners could move freely across the city, maintaining relationships and cultural ties. The sudden division in 1961 severed these connections almost overnight. Families were split without warning, with no way to reunite. For some, even attending a funeral or wedding on the other side became impossible. For those living in East Berlin, the wall symbolized entrapment. Despite the risks, many sought to escape to the west, driven by the hope of freedom and a better life. The GDR government, however, implemented increasingly sophisticated security measures to prevent defections: guard towers, armed patrols, and the infamous death strip, a no-man's land filled with sand, trenches, and mines, made crossing nearly impossible. Yet the human spirit's determination to seek freedom often overcame these barriers. Some tumbled beneath the wall, others crafted makeshift flying machines, and a few even swam across rivers. While many escapes were successful, countless others ended in tragedy, with over 100 people losing their lives in attempts to cross. In West Berlin, life continued under the shadow of the wall, but it was vastly different. As an enclave of democracy and capitalism surrounded by communist East Germany, West Berlin became a symbol of resilience and resistance. Supported by significant financial and political backing from the United States and its allies, the city flourished economically and culturally. However, the wall's presence was a constant reminder of the fragility of their position. West Berliners could travel freely, but they were acutely aware of their isolation, relying on air corridors and rail links for access to the rest of West Germany. Socially, the wall created a unique dynamic. While it physically divided the city, it also united West Berliners in their defiance of the oppressive divide. Cultural life in West Berlin thrived, with theaters, cafes, and universities becoming hubs of creativity and political discourse. The city's youth culture, influenced by Western ideals of freedom and individuality, contrasted sharply with the conformist environment of the East. The wall also became a canvas for protest and expression. West Berliners often adorned its western side with graffiti, turning it into a vivid tapestry of art and resistance. Messages of hope, defiance, and solidarity cover the concrete, symbolizing the enduring human desire for freedom. In contrast, the eastern side of the wall remained sterile and heavily guarded, reflecting the GDR's strict control over public spaces and expressions of dissent. For those in East Berlin, daily life was a mix of adaptation and quiet resistance. While the government promoted its version of socialism as a workers' paradise, many privately yearned for the opportunities and freedoms they could glimpse across the divide. Stories of escapes, successful or not, became whispered legends, fueling both hope and fear. Cultural life, though controlled, found ways to thrive in subtle acts of defiance such as underground music, secret gatherings, and coded expressions in art and literature. The Berlin Wall was not just a local barrier. It was a flashpoint in the Cold War, embodying the ideological battle between the United States and its allies in the West and the Soviet Union-led Eastern Bloc. For nearly 3 decades, the wall symbolized the broader struggle for dominance between capitalism and communism, with Berlin at the center of this geopolitical chessboard. Its construction and presence heightened tensions, shaping the trajectory of global politics during one of the most volatile periods in modern history. The Cold War, which began after the conclusion of World War II, saw the world divided into 2 competing spheres of influence. The United States, advocating for free markets and democracy, led the Western Bloc, while the Soviet Union, championing communism and centralized control, dominated the East. Berlin, geographically and politically divided, was a microcosm of this broader conflict. The city's unique position made it a focal point for both propaganda and confrontation. The wall's construction in 1961 was a direct response to one of the Cold War's most visible crises, the mass exodus of East Germans to the West. The flight of millions of citizens through Berlin exposed the failures of the communist regime and presented a severe embarrassment for the Soviet Union. The wall was a desperate measure to stop this hemorrhaging of people, but it also became a strategic asset for the Eastern Bloc. By sealing off East Berlin, the GDR could project an image of stability and control, even if it was achieved through force. For the Western Bloc, the Berlin Wall was a potent symbol of communist oppression. It became a rallying point for leaders to emphasize the values of freedom and democracy. In 1963, President John F. Kennedy delivered his famous speech in West Berlin declaring, "Ich bin ein Berliner," I am a Berliner. This statement was not only an expression of solidarity with the people of Berlin, but also a direct challenge to the Soviet Union. Kennedy's speech underscored the United States' commitment to defending West Berlin as a bulwark of freedom behind the Iron Curtain. The wall also became a theater for espionage and propaganda. Both sides used it to assert their ideological superiority. The West painted the wall as a stark example of the failures of communism, highlighting the lengths to which the Eastern Bloc would go to keep its citizens from leaving. The East, on the other hand, framed the wall as a necessary measure to protect its people from Western imperialism and the destabilizing influence of capitalism. This battle of narratives played out in speeches, media, and cultural exchanges, amplifying the wall's significance beyond its physical presence. Several Cold War confrontations centered on Berlin, with the wall often serving as a backdrop. One of the most dramatic incidents occurred in October 1961 at Checkpoint Charlie, a key crossing point between East and West Berlin. American and Soviet tanks faced off for 16 tense hours, underscoring how the city's division could easily escalate into a global conflict. Although the standoff ended without violence, it demonstrated the fragility of peace in a city that epitomized the Cold War's stakes. The wall's presence also influenced the arms race in military strategy. The United States and its NATO allies used West Berlin as a strategic outpost, investing heavily in its defense. The Soviet Union, in turn, stationed troops and built up its military presence in East Germany. The result was a heavily militarized city where any misstep could spark a larger confrontation. This fragile equilibrium was maintained through a delicate balance of deterrence and diplomacy, but the constant threat of escalation loomed large. Despite the wall's role in maintaining the status quo, cracks in the Eastern Bloc began to emerge by the late 1970s and early 1980s. Economic stagnation, growing discontent among citizens, and the pressures of an arms race that could ill afford began to erode the Soviet Union's hold over its satellite states. The election of Ronald Reagan as U.S. president in 1981 marked a more aggressive Western posture, with Reagan famously calling on Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev in 1987 to tear down this wall. This rhetoric, coupled with increased military spending by the West, placed additional strain on the Soviet Union. Gorbachev's ascension to power in 1985 brought significant changes. His policies of glasnost, openness, and perestroika, restructuring, signaled a willingness to reform the Soviet system. These reforms, while aimed at revitalizing the Eastern Bloc, unintentionally emboldened movements for freedom and independence across Eastern Europe. In East Germany, calls for reform grew louder, as citizens demanded greater freedoms and an end to the oppressive regime. But the fall of the Berlin Wall on November 9, 1989, was a watershed moment in modern history. It marked the symbolic end of the Cold War, the collapse of communist regimes across Eastern Europe, and the reunification of a divided Germany. While the moment itself appeared spontaneous and euphoric, it was the result of decades of tension, protest, and reform that culminated in one of the most iconic events of the 20th century. By the late 1980s, cracks in the Eastern Bloc were becoming impossible to ignore. Mikhail Gorbachev's policies of glasnost, openness, and perestroika, restructuring, were intended to revitalize the Soviet Union, but they inadvertently weakened its grip on satellite states like East Germany. Across Eastern Europe, movements for freedom gained momentum. In Poland, the Solidarity labor movement had forced political reforms, while Hungary had begun dismantling its border fence with Austria. These changes signaled that the ironclad control of the Soviet Union over Eastern Europe was beginning to falter. In East Germany, dissatisfaction with the regime was growing. The economy was stagnant, and the repressive measures of the Stasi's secret police created a climate of fear and resentment. Mass protests erupted in cities like Leipzig, where the Monday demonstrations began in September 1989. What started as small gatherings soon grew into massive rallies, with tens of thousands of East Germans demanding political reform, freedom of speech, and the right to travel. The East German government, led by Erich Honecker, initially responded with repression, but the sheer scale of the protests made it impossible to maintain control. In October 1989, Honecker was forced to resign, replaced by Egon Krenz, who promised reforms but failed to win public trust. Meanwhile, thousands of East Germans fled to neighboring countries like Hungary and Czechoslovakia, taking advantage of newly opened borders to reach the West. The exodus of citizens added to the regime's instability, signaling that the status quo was unsustainable. The events leading directly to the wall's fall began with a press conference on November 9, 1989. Günter Schabowski, a senior East German official, was tasked with announcing new travel regulations intended to ease public discontent. However, Schabowski's briefing was poorly prepared, and when asked by reporters when the new rules would take effect, he hesitated before responding. "As far as I know, effective immediately." The statement, broadcast live, caused widespread confusion and excitement. Within hours, thousands of East Berliners gathered at border checkpoints demanding passage to the west. Overwhelmed and unsure how to respond, border guards initially stalled, but as the crowds swelled, the pressure became unbearable. At approximately 10:30 p.m., the guards at the Bornholmer Street checkpoint relented, opening the gates. The same scene played out at other checkpoints, and within hours, Berliners from both sides were pouring through the once impenetrable wall. The images of East and West Berliners embracing, climbing the wall, and chipping away at its concrete with hammers and chisels became defining moments of the era. The celebrations captured the joy and relief of the city and a world that had been divided for too long. For many, it was the realization of a long-held dream, the reunification of Berlin and the end of the oppressive divide. The fall of the Berlin Wall had immediate and profound consequences. It signaled the collapse of the East German regime, which disbanded within weeks. In the months that followed, negotiations between East and West Germany led to the country's formal reunification on October 3, 1990. The fall of the wall also accelerated the dissolution of the Soviet Union, which would officially cease to exist by the end of 1991. Globally, the fall of the Berlin Wall was seen as a triumph of freedom over oppression, democracy over dictatorship. It marked the end of an era defined by ideological conflict and symbolized the possibility of a more unified and peaceful world. However, the transition was not without challenges. The reunification of Germany brought economic and social difficulties as the former East integrated with the West. The scars of division, both physical and emotional, would take years to heal. The night of November 9, 1989 remains one of the most iconic moments in history. The fall of the Berlin Wall was not just the result of a press conference mishap or a misstep by border guards. It was the culmination of years of courage, defiance, and a collective yearning for freedom. It continues to serve as a reminder of the power of ordinary people to bring about extraordinary change. In the next section, we'll explore the reunification of Germany and the challenges and triumphs that followed this historic event. The fall of the Berlin Wall and the reunification of Germany stand as defining moments in modern history, marking the end of decades of division and the beginning of a new era for Germany, Europe, and the world. The legacy of the wall, both as a symbol and a physical barrier, continues to shape how we understand freedom, unity, and resilience. For Germany, the reunification brought both challenges and triumphs. The integration of East and West required immense economic, social, and political efforts. While the process was fraught with difficulties, including economic disparities and cultural divides, it ultimately fostered a stronger, united nation. Today, Germany is one of the leading powers in Europe, with Berlin serving as a vibrant capital that symbolizes reconciliation and progress. On a global scale, the fall of the Berlin Wall marked the end of the Cold War, a conflict that had defined much of the 20th century. It signaled the collapse of communist regimes across Eastern Europe and the disintegration of the Soviet Union, fundamentally reshaping the geopolitical landscape. The end of the division between East and West paved the way for European integration, culminating in the expansion of the European Union and NATO to include former Eastern Bloc countries. The wall's fall also had profound cultural and psychological impacts. For those who lived in its shadow, it represented not just physical separation, but also a denial of freedom and opportunity. Its destruction was a powerful affirmation of human determination and the universal desire for liberty. The iconic images of Berliners tearing down the wall remain etched in collective memory, symbolizing hope and the triumph of unity over division. The Berlin Wall has become a potent symbol in historical and political discourse. Pieces of the wall now stand in museums and public spaces around the world, serving as reminders of the consequences of division and the importance of working toward peace and understanding. The story of the wall and its fall continues to inspire movements for freedom and democracy, resonating with those fighting oppression in all forms. The lessons of the Berlin Wall are both cautionary and hopeful. It serves as a reminder of how barriers, whether physical, ideological, or social, can fracture societies and hinder progress. Yet, it also demonstrates the power of collective action, diplomacy, and the enduring human spirit to overcome those barriers. The wall's history underscores the importance of unity, dialogue, and the pursuit of common ground in addressing global challenges. 30 years after its fall, the Berlin Wall remains a touchstone for discussions about division and reconciliation. Its legacy lives on in the stories of those who resisted, the families it separated, and the people who worked tirelessly to bring it down. As a symbol, it continues to remind us of the cost of division and the enduring value of freedom and unity. The story of the Berlin Wall is one of contrast, division and unity, oppression and liberation, despair and hope. Its rise and fall encapsulate the human struggle for freedom and justice, making it a chapter in history that will never lose its relevance or power. Today, as we reflect on the lessons of the Berlin Wall, we are reminded that even the most formidable barriers can be dismantled through courage, resilience, and a shared vision for a better future.